Okay, so to wrap up today, having now gone through the systems approach and talked about quality control initiatives in criminal justice, now we're going to turn to errors in criminal justice, what we know and what we don't. The Innocence Movement has created nationwide awareness about the breadth and depth of errors in criminal justice in the past quarter century, and it really is the grassroots awareness of that and desire to impact and increase conviction integrity that has led to the creation of the Quattrone Center. At the same time, there's limits on our knowledge and our ability to prioritize potential reforms, and so we've assembled a panel with a group of folks with deep experience in many of the different types of efforts that we believe currently are prevalent in the criminal justice system. And we're going to talk about what some of those errors are and what the data does and maybe does not tell us, so that we have an opportunity to talk about what the next steps are as we continue to gain more knowledge about the problems that we face. To moderate the panel, I'm pleased to introduce David Rudovsky, a senior fellow at Penn Law and again one of the Quattrone Center's affiliated faculty. David is one of the nation's leading civil rights and criminal defense attorneys, practicing at the firm of Karras, Rudovsky, Messing, and Feinberg. He's been a senior fellow at Penn since 1988, teaches courses in criminal law, constitutional criminal procedure, and evidence. He's the co-author of Police Misconduct, Law and Litigation, which was published in 2012, and The Law of Arrest, Search, and Seizure in Pennsylvania, most recently published in 2011. His awards include a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, an award for accomplishments in civil rights, law, and criminal justice, the ACLU Civil Liberties Award, and most recently his 5th Harvey Levin Award for excellence in teaching in the law school. He's also won a University of Pennsylvania Lindbeck Award for teaching excellence in 1996. David?
Thanks, John. And to the credit of the people who've formulated this conference and invited the speakers, it's unusual for a conference like this at 3:45 in the afternoon, or almost 4. Everybody who was here this morning is still here this afternoon, and people are already talking about tomorrow's program. So it's great. So thanks to all the organizers of this, the Quattrone Center and the University of Pennsylvania. Learned Hand, about 80 years ago, said, "We're haunted by the nightmare of innocent persons being convicted." And then he said, "That's not a reality." Well, that's an easy target, I suppose, to make at a conference like this. To be overconfident about a system like our criminal justice system is certainly a fault in itself. But part of the problem for Learned Hand, of course, was he had no data. He had no way of knowing whether or not our system does right or wrong. And it didn't take the DNA revolution to show many of us that confident and perhaps overconfident assessment of the system really didn't make sense. But we've learned a lot from the DNA revolution. We've learned a lot about other studies into the criminal justice system, some of which you've just heard about. We've learned that there is such a thing as false confessions. We've learned more about the problems of eyewitness identification. We've learned more about the problems of forensics, both questions of good and bad science and good and bad laboratories. We've learned much about the role of lawyers in the system and how those lawyers can either improve or make more problematic the questions of reliability and fairness. Defense lawyers who, for one reason or another, often because of lack of resources, simply don't provide effective assistance of counsel. Prosecutors and police who, for one reason or another, sometimes don't follow their duty, turning over exculpatory evidence and playing by the rules. So the DNA cases, other studies have highlighted a number of potential problems that we think we know something about in terms of trying to reform the system. But that knowledge, which we've gleaned more over the past 20 years, probably raise more questions than they answer. We have been unable, as one of the questions before indicated, to even kind of quantify the scope of this problem. We've got some data. We've got 315 or 320 DNA exonerations. We have an exoneration list nationally of some 1,300 or 1,400 cases. All we can agree on is that may be the tip of the iceberg, but we don't know how deep or how broad that iceberg may be. So where is the data? We've identified some of what we think are the causes of wrongful convictions, but we don't know, again, how many and what kind of remedies, even if we make remedies, learning from our past mistakes, are actually going to work in practice. In other words, while we know something, I urge us not to be overconfident. Learned of the Hand was overconfident. We shouldn't be overconfident at this point. We should be skeptical. We should be continuing to ask our questions whether we've focused on the right issues. We should continue to ask for the right kind of data, and we should continue to think in the future, how do we measure? How do we measure the types of reforms that we're talking about, whether they really work? Something the Quattrone Center will be doing, and virtually everybody in this room will be doing. To talk about those problems, about what we know and what we don't know, we have another excellent panel here today. I'll briefly introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. Jim Trainum, all the way to the right, spent 27 years with the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, 19 as a homicide detective. He's currently a member of the International Homicide Investigators Associations. He has become an expert. He's written about and studied this phenomenon of false confessions. I think something that came to his light through a case he actually investigated while he was a homicide detective in Washington. He's going to be talking somewhat about the issues of false confessions. Jules Epstein, second to my right here, is a professor of law at Widener School of Law. He's the director of Widener's Advocacy, Technology, and Public Service Institute. Jules, for many years, was a public defender, but much more important, for the past 20 years, has been my law partner in my practice. That's not why he's on the panel. He brings his own special expertise, and he has specialized in the last number of years on questions of forensics and labs, and is currently a member of a new National Commission on Forensic Sciences, an advisory committee to the U.S. Department of Justice. Our third speaker will be Mike Ambrosino, seated in the middle there, which will be a good counterpoint for what you hear from Jules Epstein on the questions of forensics and science. Mike is a special counsel to the U.S. attorneys. His primary responsibility is oversight in the development, introduction, and consideration of forensic evidence, DNA, fingerprint evidence, firearms, tool marks, what kind of analysis, what kind of protocols ought to be in place. Michael has experience in that area, not only through scientific study, but through a lot of litigation. He's been a prosecutor for a number of years, and he's built up a special expertise that he's used not only in his own cases, but now shares nationally with federal prosecutors across the country. Dan Simon, immediately to my right, is a professor of law and psychology at the University of Southern California Law School, teaches at the intersection of law and psychology, and has considered and written about and talked about all the issues we're talking about here today in terms of wrongful convictions. For those of you who have not seen or read his book, In Doubt, it's essential reading, I think, for persons in this field. Dan brings together from a legal and psychological perspective a lot of the issues and problems that we're going to be talking about today. Finally, my good friend Sam Gross will wind up the panel. Sam is a professor of law at Michigan Law School. He's had long experience in the criminal justice system, criminal defense lawyer, cooperating lawyer with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He's written and thought widely on the questions of exonerations and innocence, and is the current editor of the National Registry of Exonerations, which is probably our best database nationally for trying to determine the extent and depth of the questions of exonerations and wrongful convictions. And Sam, while Dan writes a book in that, Sam really has doubts about where we are and where we're going. So we'll hear from all of them. And first, Jim Trainum.
I always have to bring up that my claim to fame is I screwed up. I got it wrong. I got a false confession. Actually, I've gotten two in my career. And I wanted to find out why it happened, how it happened, and in doing the research, I wanted to take that experience and teach my colleagues so as to help them avoid the same problems. What I'm going to do is start off with asking a question that I'm often asked by my colleagues when it comes to this topic. And that is, when it comes to the big picture, are false confessions really a problem? I mean, I understand that question, because back when I was first trained in interrogation, it was a non-issue. I mean, we were taught that they did not happen unless the person was mentally ill. And yeah, DNA, they uncovered a few, little cases here and there seems to be more in the news all the time. But when you consider all the interrogations that take place every single year in the U.S., the few bad cases that surface just seem to pale in comparison. So is it a problem, or is the media just focusing on those few bad apples there? Now, regardless of the research, the critics are very fond of pointing out that we still have no baseline of the number of false confession cases. But then the research is also hampered by all sorts of data collection issues. Now, I do find it interesting that in a survey of police officers that they think, in their opinion, that 5% of the confessions out there are false. But let's look at this from a totally different angle. Do we have a baseline of how many times law enforcement takes the very first step on the path to getting a false confession? The first step being the identification of an innocent person as a suspect. Do we have an idea just how often we do get it wrong? And it turns out we do. It's from a 1995 survey of laboratories that were doing DNA comparisons before the advent of the CODIS database. Back then, the suspect's known DNA sample had to be submitted along with the sample from the crime scene. The labs reported that the test excluded the suspect as a contributor of the crime scene DNA 23% of the time. And remember, getting the suspect's DNA sample back then usually involved some sort of court order or search warrant, a whole lot more than just a hunch. Now, it's my contention that false confessions themselves are only the tip of the iceberg. Often, when we believe that a witness is not being straight or a cooperator just needs a little incentive, our interviews look more like interrogations. And we use the same problematic tactics, mindsets, and that can lead to false confessions. We create what I'll be calling unreliable statement evidence. Now, there are many types, all of which can help convict an innocent person, as well as screw up your case so that the guilty people go free. So what you'll be hearing me use are the terms false confession and unreliable statement evidence interchangeably. Now, in any discussion about interviewing and interrogation in the U.S., you naturally have to talk about what is known as the Reid technique. It was developed back in the 1930s, 1940s, I believe, as an alternative to the third degree. And Reid is considered to be the standard for law enforcement in this country. Even if a detective says that they've received no formal training in interrogation, you will see aspects of the Reid technique in their interrogation tactics. But to their credit, after decades of denying that false confessions can happen, Reid has begun to incorporate some of their information about false confessions in their textbooks and on their website. Unfortunately, little of this reaches the average student. Most interrogation training is only a 3 to 4 day course. There's no practical exercises, there's no tests, and more importantly, there's no follow-up evaluations of how the students are doing. An example of the problem is found in Reid's position on deception. Reid is a firm supporter of law enforcement's ability to use deception, even though this tactic has been identified as one of the most problematic. And I agree with the last bullet that's up there, but then again, is this how the interrogation goes? I'll walk in the room and go, "Hey buddy, we found your fingerprints on the gun." "Okay, thank you very much." No, we use it in conjunction with all the other interrogation techniques that we have. And Reid itself admits that when you do that, you could have a problem. And only a few people know that, at least here, Reid warns that even the use of implied threats and implied promises is problematic. The way that I see it, interrogation training in the U.S. is like teaching a doctor a surgical procedure without teaching them the possible hazards, side effects, or how to recognize and deal with them. Now, let's go back to our 3-step program on getting a false confession. Is there something about our training that contributes to us taking the first step? Absolutely. Every single interrogation training I've ever been to devotes a huge block of time to behavioral analysis. We are taught that by careful observation of a subject's body language and verbal responses, we can determine deception or even guilt over 80% of the time. We become human lie detectors. The problem is with this is that especially when it comes to the application of this in the field, it's mostly crap. Even Reed offers some cautions when interpreting this behavior. And these cautions, which at least in my case, involve 90% of the people that I had to deal with over time. What makes this even more inaccurate is when tunnel vision kicks in. And we cops are cynical people. We always assume people are lying to us, and you know that suspect is in that interrogation room for a reason. Now, a good example of how tunnel vision impacts us when it comes to this sort of analysis and found in the book Homicide Life on the Streets. It's written by a reporter who was embedded in the homicide unit in Baltimore for over a year. He documented the things that detectives would look for to determine whether or not a person was lying. And basically, they were uncooperative, they talked too much, they get the story perfectly straight, they blink too much, or they avoid eye contact. Other things that they would look for: too cooperative, talk too little, screw the story up, don't blink, or they stare. We basically see what we are looking for. And we use this so-called skill to make many, many decisions that guide our investigations. Which witnesses to believe? Who becomes our suspect? Is that jailhouse snitch reliable? And when do we switch from interview to interrogation mode? Which leads me up to the second step of obtaining unreliable statement evidence. Now, we don't have time to go into the specific steps and the specific techniques, which have pretty much time and time again been ruled acceptable by the courts. But then again, the courts, like our interrogation training, focuses on admissibility, not reliability. So now I do want to discuss how the goals and the structure of the interrogation itself contribute to the problem. So why do we interrogate? Any officer, any detective who knows how to testify is going to say, I interrogate in order to obtain the truth. But interrogation is guilt presumptive. It's a one-sided monologue designed to get an admission. And the truth that the detective was talking about is an admission to the truth as the detective perceives it to be. And what if that detective has it wrong? So what is it about the interrogation process itself that would induce an innocent person to confess or a witness to give unreliable information? It's the very same thing that causes a guilty person to confess. Our tactics take the perception that a confession should be believed because it's a statement against self-interest, and we turn it on its head. Our tactics create the temporary and false perception that it is totally in the suspect's best interest to tell me what we want to hear, what we perceive to be the truth. And the main safeguard that we have, that we believe we have, that to keep us from getting a false confession is the belief that we know one when we see one. We can tell the unreliable from the reliable. After all, the reliable will not have those details that, as we are so fond of saying, only the killer would know. In reality, false confessions contain tons of those details. But how? I'm a careful detective. I would never let that information slip into an interrogation. But we do. And that's the third step in getting a false confession or unreliable statement evidence. We contaminate the confession or the statement. And there are lots of ways of doing this. And actually, some of the interrogation tactics that we are taught actually facilitate this. Finally, we fail to do the proper fact-checking. And the unreliable statement evidence or the confession makes it to the jury. We fail to critically examine the statement evidence by following Basic Investigation 101, which brings me to my recommendations, not only in the prevention of false confessions, but how to keep those false confessions or unreliable statement evidence from getting to a jury. First off, videotaping. Interrogations, interviews, witnesses, victims, and all of that in its entirety. This does not prevent false confessions or unreliable statement evidence. It only provides a means for an independent and critical review and the examination of the statement evidence for contamination. But the person doing the review needs to know what they're looking for. And because tunnel vision plays such a huge role in unreliable statement evidence, the review has to be done by somebody not involved with the case. And this includes the prosecutor prosecuting the case. Which leads me to my second recommendation. Now, take it from me. This is not a path to popularity. This is why it needs to be an assigned position. It's that person's job to poke holes in a dominant theory and to critically review the evidence. Because it's their job, it helps them to avoid the repercussions of groupthink. We need to close the gap that is left by the interrogation schools, but we need to include all players in the criminal justice system. Though unreliable statement evidence begins with me, the detective, everybody else plays a part in moving that evidence towards a conviction. Much like we have hearings to contest the reliability of eyewitness identification evidence, we need the same for statement evidence. We need the opportunity for experts to testify on the topic. One suggestion has been to restrict the use of interrogation. We have to limit when law enforcement can go into interrogation mode. It has to be something more than just by the twitching of our thumbs. And one might ask, why not simply reform the way that we do interrogations, just like we're now doing with eyewitness identification and other areas? In the private sector, it takes very little, number-wise, to prompt a recall of a product or a procedure. Maybe it's time for a recall of Reed. In fact, it's been done. In the UK and other countries, they've outlawed about everything Reed holds near, that we hold near and dear to us. They've implemented what they call the P style of interviewing. It's based on real science. It's basically there to gather information and avoid all the problems resulting from the tactics that we use now of how we do business in the U.S. The last recommendation is don't take my word for any of this. Apply the lessons that have been presented here, but in order for that to work, law enforcement has to open its files, they have to support data collection and research, and they have to be open to the findings that come from that. And thank you guys very much.
All right, so while we're setting this up for the next one, I'm going to be talking about forensic evidence, and I'm going to sound like a critic because I am. But I want to make it clear that I'm not a throw the baby out with the bathwater person. The National Academy of Science report in 2009 began by saying forensic discipline evidence is incredibly important, it's valuable, it's useful. So I start there. But with that as a background, I want to talk about problems. And I thought that the first way was to try and figure out what do forensic evidence problems look like. And I came up with 6. And some, I don't know what we do about malfeasance. My law school's in Delaware. We have thefts, okay? I'm not sure what we can do about that at this conference, all right? Dry labbing, we can only talk about it at the end by audits. But these are some of the problems that have occurred over the years in forensic evidence. Okay, what's the next one? Well, the one with the blood thing here is just not a problem. It's just some evidence can only show so much. When I was a young public defender trying rape cases, we had ABO typing, right? That's how you figured things out, so it could put people in a class. So part of forensic science problems is sometimes it can't answer all the questions. But then we get the real problems again. Overstating findings, okay? Comparative bullet-lead analysis. I can tell that this bullet came from this box and no other box. Well, no, it came from maybe 1 million boxes. Okay, so these are some of the categories, and there are 2 more. Science moves on, and what purports to be science in a particular era, oops, it's not. Okay, and then there's practitioner error, because this is a human function. And that's Brandon Mayfield with the infamous latent print that caused the FBI, which previously had said, we have a 0 error rate, which is impossible to have, to change its ways. So that's, if you will, just a sort of an intro to what are errors. Okay? Again, we came up with one of the same visuals. The understanding of this, right, at least comes back to 1996. Janet Reno commissioned this report. If you've never read it, you ought to. It's a study of the first, I always forget if it's 28 DNA exonerations. And one of the things it said, we have a science problem. And be very thankful for people like Sam Gross and Brandon Garrett. I filched this off of Professor Garrett's webpage, so he gets the credit. But if you look at this from the DNA cases, and then you look back at what were the types of discipline, because I'm not always going to use the word science, right? And a lot of them are disciplines, and disciplines can be good, but being a discipline is not the same as being a science. You see that in many of these, we had them sometimes with valid statements and sometimes invalid. So Brandon Garrett and Peter Neufeld in a very important article said, what do those words even mean, right? What is valid? What is invalid? And you can see when we misuse information or extrapolate out to conclusions that just don't have foundation. Yet that would happen again and again and again. Okay, so I learned, you left. I don't know what happened. Oh, there you are. Okay, guys, thank you. I got worried here. Thank you. All right, so, when we're talking about today, it was that Sam Gross is going to say, what don't you know, right? And that we can quantify this. And of course, in forensic discipline evidence cases, we'll never be able to quantify a number that are wrong. There's no ground truth in many cases. We're never going to know. Right? We're not going to have DNA or some other measure in certain cases to say, oh, I know this was wrong here. And sometimes it doesn't really matter because maybe the forensics was wrong, but we have the right person anyway, or there's lots of other evidence. So if that's the science problem, or discipline, that would be enough. But I'm afraid the problem is still much deeper. So I want to go through that. Let me ask a question. How many of you, raise your hand, how many of you are lawyers? Come on. Hello? Okay. Now, how many of you lawyers have a science background? I'm sorry. I see 2 hands. Oh, 3. Okay. Well, the problem, number one, is nationally the percentage of people who end up going to law school and either practicing or, heaven forfend, being judges, about 4 to 5%. So this is pretty representative here, have a science background. So the folks going into court to try and make sense of this or use this or challenge it don't know what they're talking about. All right? Well, what about Fry and Daubert? Okay, this man up here, our former dean, okay, he was my dean here, one of the greatest judges in the United States ever, reversed himself over a course of 6 weeks and wrote 2 opinions that are both consistent with Daubert. One says fingerprint evidence should be restricted because Daubert says so. 6 weeks later, fingerprint evidence should not be restricted. Daubert says so. Okay? And so you have to say, maybe we have a test problem. And I've done some work on this. The Daubert test, if you really study it, is not a particularly stringent test. And the reason I have Turkish taffy up there, that's what that is, for Fry, is that Fry is an elastic test. If you want to keep the evidence in, the judge makes a very narrow community. Remember we said it has to be accepted in the relevant community? So, do all fingerprint examiners accept fingerprint evidence? Okay, that's a good community. If you want to keep it out, we'd make it a larger community. We don't have a test of what's the right community. So even our legal tests don't live up to really making us able to scrutinize forensic evidence. We have other problems. Peter Neufeld said something to me recently about a cognitive bias of judges, about what they'll let in and what they'll keep out. And we have disparate treatment of evidence in civil versus criminal cases. And we're not, more parade of horrors, sorry. We're not done with the problems yet. Okay, where's my friend from San Francisco? All right, you have a great public defender office, all right? And still you're overworked, right? So the problem is when we litigate these cases, when we litigated the fingerprint challenge in front of Judge Pollack, it was a capital death case, right? Death case, federal capital case, forgive me. So we had this enormous budget. I probably exhausted my budget for the next 50 cases in that one. So we have overworked people who don't have a science background, who don't have a model, And frankly, I'm convinced that often a Daubert or Frye hearing is a bad place to solve science problems because it's adversarial. So those are some of the problems. Let me give you a couple more. We have no standard national terminology in forensics. What does the word match mean? We have no standard nationally for what is discoverable, what lab reports have to be turned over. We have no standard for what a lab report looks like. We don't require accreditation. We don't require certification. We don't always require proficiency tests. So there are the problems. Okay, I'm going to sit down now. Now, almost, okay? So, okay, define the problem, then you solve the problem. We're at a special time right now because of the work of folks like the Innocence Project and because of DNA and because of non-DNA issues like Kathy Lynn Henderson and the issue of shaken baby syndrome, right? Because of CBLA and the National Academy of Sciences. I think we're at a pretty important time historically where there's a greater awareness than ever that forensics is not always science, okay? Quick note here, not on the slides, except for DNA, most forensic disciplines didn't originate in the lab and then get moved to police work. They originated in police work. And some of them are great, but it's not science. So, trying to say what's going on real quickly here, NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, has proposed an organization of scientific area committees. I think this is kind of an idea to replace what are called the SWIGs, the scientific working groups. And what's really important for the first time is that they're saying on every one of these committees, so if you're in the Leighton Prince field, or you're the firearms field, or the whatever, there will be non-disciplined scientists on that committee. A critical mass, so maybe a biologist or an engineer or a systems person to say, let's ramp it up. Okay, you've heard I'm on this National Commission of Forensic Science. It's 30 people and there are 29 really smart ones. Okay, and I think I was there because I could spell DNA. But, all right, it's this wonderful group of people and it's amazing because the science people there are primarily not forensics people. We have a couple of DNA folks there, but we have physicists and a Nobel chemist. It's a fascinating group of people. And one of our tasks is going to be to do recommendations to the Attorney General on where research money should be spent and how it should be spent. So a little bit of moving towards some potential, I don't know, solutions, but improvements. So I tried to think of some others, and I don't know who does this, and maybe this is like your devil's advocate or something. You need somebody to look in periodically, and we need audits. And not only do we need audits of labs, we need audits of what goes on in the courtroom. Okay, there are some places that occasionally do that. They'll say, we'll monitor the testimony of our lab people. It has to be done all the time. And I hate to say it, but the lawyers have to be monitored too. Okay, and the last one that I could come up with is intensive education. This is like a duh, okay? But I'll start off with that 5%. I travel around the country. I teach for the National Judicial College. I do CLEs across the country. And I always ask when I do a forensics one, how many, I'm not going to embarrass you folks here, how many of you have heard of the National Academy's report? Well, I wasn't going to ask because I didn't want to embarrass the rest, okay? But I'm so glad you put your hand up. You're very compliant, okay? All right, and then I say, well, how many of you have read it? Or even the executive summary. And I'm often talking to defense attorneys who I think, this is like the Bible, right? Well, they haven't read it. So we need massive outreach. We need forensics teams. Okay, I don't know if you have this, Mr. Defender. I know, and I'm not saying that critically. There are only a few offices in the country. Washington PDS, okay? Delaware State Public Defender has a forensic team. That's critical, and we're going to hear about sort of forensic team in the prosecutor's office. We need online resources, and having said all that, don't forget it all falls apart because of federalism. So, right, our commission is a national commission, and all we can do is make recommendations to the Attorney General. And the theory is that if we make recommendations and he adopts some of them, there will be this filter down effect. So that's the last part, so that's the problem. But that's some ideas about forensics and tiptoeing towards some possible remedial responses. Thank you.
So you've just heard what some of the problems are. I'll try and tell you what some of the solutions I think have been at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C. And I'll talk to you a little bit about what we've done there forensically to implement protocols and procedures to try and attain investigative integrity in all of our investigations. It might surprise you to learn that much of what was just said, I would agree with. I think historically, there's been a huge problem in certain soft sciences being oversold or overstated, either by the analysts who are presented in court or by the prosecutors in their closing arguments. And that's something that we've paid a lot of attention to at the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. One of the first things I did when I got to the front office was to implement uniform procedures. My goal was very simple. It was to make sure that every single prosecutor in my office, we have over 300 of them, were to utilize every single forensic tool at their disposal for every violent crime case. And it seems like a very simple goal, but in reality it really isn't. When I first came to homicide cases back in the 90s, when long before Bob Mueller was the director of the FBI, he was actually our homicide chief. And back then, it was a very disjointed system. I remember my first homicide investigation, and the way things worked back then is the mobile crime officers would collect evidence, and they'd send it down to the FBI, and the FBI would look at the evidence and they'd test it. And the prosecutors would get the results. Nobody spoke to one another. The mobile crime officers wouldn't talk to the lab wouldn't talk to the prosecutors, and that was the beginning and the end of the process. You took what you got. DNA testing took a year. It took a year. You did one round of DNA testing. You had no idea whether they were testing the right evidence or not. And you just lived with whatever results you got. We can turn things around in a day now if we're willing to pay for it. In a few years, we'll probably be able to turn results around inside an hour or 2 hours and have things uploaded into the national database within an hour or two. That's a huge step forward in the integrity of our investigations. One of the first things I did was I required every single prosecutor in our office in every violent crime case where there's potentially DNA evidence to sit down with myself and the officials at the newly created Department of Forensic Sciences and to go through the evidence and decide what items should be tested and what methodology should be utilized. That's not always a straightforward question. And I did it for two reasons. One, for the integrity of that particular case, but also to train people, to train detectives and to train prosecutors in how to think about cases, because my hope was that they would learn something in every single meeting and that they'd bring it forward to their next investigation. Managing people's expectations, informing them in the context of their investigations, for me was critical. But also to get them to think about DNA as an ongoing process. We no longer just do one round of testing. For our serious cases, we have 9-month indictment clocks. That allows us to do 3 rounds of DNA testing. So where we used to just accept the first round of results, we'll choose what items to test, we'll do a round of testing, and then we'll revisit it, depending on the kind of results we get and where those results take us and whether they cause us to reevaluate the theory of our case. And so, very simple example, we had a young girl who got off a school bus, wrong stop, she was lost, she ended up going down an alley where she was sexually assaulted by a homeless man. We believed her story, but it was a very problematic case. We had a lot of problems with our complaining witness. We did DNA testing, and we got no results. Now, 5 years ago, that investigation would have stopped there. So we reconvened. I met with the prosecutor, and I met with lab officials at a private lab that we consult when we're not getting the results that we are hopeful for in our initial round of testing. I explained the situation. They looked at the raw data, and they said that the case would benefit from YSTR testing because they saw evidence of semen, but they felt that the female DNA was probably masking the male DNA. We did another round of testing, and we got a profile consistent with the defendant's YSTR profile. And that defendant ended up, after that second round of testing, pleading up to the indictment in the case. Every time we do an additional round of testing, that round of testing might corroborate our victim. It might be completely neutral, depending on the facts of our case, or it might contradict our evidence or our theory of the case, which will cause us to reevaluate our case and either take it in a different direction or drop our investigation altogether. In my view, the more aggressive we are, the more thorough we are, the more integrity that attaches to that particular investigation. And that's something that we've tried to build into our system. You heard the public defender from San Francisco talk about checklists. Well, we not only have checklists, but in order for prosecutors in our jurisdiction now to actually get testing done, once we have these meetings, they actually have to fill out electronic forms to have their testing completed. And so that we ensure through this electronic system that they're actually doing everything that's required of them. And so that all the information about the investigation is being passed on to the chain of command, not just in our police department, but in our laboratory as well. And we don't just tell them who to send it to, we build that into the system. So when they hit the send button, it goes to the right chain of command. A chain of command that changes every week as the personnel in those organizations change. And so what we've tried to institute is a system that's constantly changing and evolving as our technologies get better. We talk to our lab all the time, and we talk to the private lab that we use to see what methodologies are coming on board so that we can better our investigations. I mean, our view of forensics, if we're going to be doing our jobs as well as we can, has to change. It has to evolve because science is changing. I hope that in the next 2 years, we're going to see rapid DNA as a reality, and we're going to be able to use it out in the field so that when a woman is sexually assaulted, we'll be able to take a rape kit, get a DNA result, and have that result uploaded into the national database within 90 minutes. 10 years ago, it was taking us a year to get a DNA result. If we can get a DNA result in 90 minutes instead of a year, that reduction of time is going to create a huge advantage to law enforcement, because conducting a search warrant 90 minutes after a crime is committed is a whole lot more effective than conducting a search warrant a year later or 2 years later or 5 years later. And there are other systems in place. One of the things that we're very aggressive with is the use of the CODIS system. And CODIS, just like additional rounds of testing, sometimes corroborates our theory of a case. When we take a profile from a crime scene and we upload it into the combined DNA indexing system, that upload can corroborate our theory of a case. It can associate our people with fellow gang members or family members. And oftentimes, or sometimes, it'll contradict the theory of our case, which will cause us to completely reevaluate what our theory may be and where the direction that our case will be going in. And that's not the only database that we use. We use ballistic databases. One of the things that I found that when I came into my position was that the police department was conducting what they call NIBIN searches at the tail end of investigations. And people were learning the NIBIN system is a system by which you enter in ballistics evidence, and it'll basically tell you when the gun in your case was used in other instances, when it has been previously used. That information can be hugely valuable to a prosecutor, But the reality is that for years, we did without that information. And again, just like CODIS, that information might corroborate our theory of the case or it might contradict it. We never know, but if we don't go down that road, our investigation is going to have less integrity. And so our objective is to just try to make sure that we do as much as we possibly can. One thing I'd like to respond to is Jules raised the issue of, well, who's the scientific community? How do we define the scientific community? And we've actually given a lot of thought to that because we did find that in a lot of the soft sciences, like fingerprints and firearms, we felt that in years past that some of our experts were overstating their conclusions. And so we didn't just turn to our practitioners. We defined the scientific community as fourfold. We defined it as practitioners, people who are conducting research in the field, people who are publishing in peer-reviewed scientific journals, and people who are members of nationally and internationally recognized bodies. That was how we defined our scientific community, and the most important criteria was who was not in the scientific community, and that was lawyers. Because lawyers oftentimes try to pass themselves off as members of the relevant scientific community. And we didn't consider ourselves experts, and we didn't consider a lot of the people who were being put forward as experts for the other side as being experts. So that's the group that we turned to. And what we found was it changed the way that we presented evidence in court. I can tell you as a prosecutor and somebody who oversees our post-conviction DNA testing, prosecutors really do want to get it right. There's nothing, it's horrible when you have to call a former prosecutor and tell them that we've exonerated somebody and that they were the prosecutor on the case. In fact, I, not so long ago, made a call to an attorney who was the prosecutor in one of our earlier cases 3 years back, and I called him again last year, and the first words out of his mouth were, "You're not going to tell me that I have another wrongful conviction, are you?" And I was able to tell him no, but he was actually the supervisor, and I was trying to get information about that case. So it was sort of a good news, bad news sort of thing. In addition to moving forward, we're also looking back. We're constantly looking back. We were the first office in the country to do a comprehensive hair and fiber review, which we're coming to the tail end of. And so we've gone back. We no longer use hair evidence at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C. It's only a screening tool for mitochondrial DNA testing. But we also formed a committee to go back and to look at every single hair case where prior to 2000, where there was a resulting conviction, and to take a look at the integrity of that conviction. And in cases where we had concerns about it, we immediately reached out to our local Innocence Project and searched for the evidence to see if we could conduct DNA testing. So we're not only looking forward, we try to look back. And the other way we've looked back is to provide open letters to the defense bar to let the defense bar in our community know that if there are any cases where there are concerns about the integrity of the conviction, that we will order up the evidence ourselves, we'll inventory it for them, and then we'll meet with them prior to their filing any formal claim to see that if we can come up with an agreed-upon testing protocol. We actually did this just 2 weeks ago. Just 30 days from the time we notified our local Innocence Project of a case, we had the testing completed, and in fact, it does look like it's going to become another exoneration. We want to let the defense bar know in Washington, D.C. that this is something that we're open to and that we want to know. It's critical for us to know whether or not we can stand by a conviction. And if we can't, we're the first ones that want to order up the evidence, get it tested, and find out, put our evidence to the test. No prosecutor wants to stand by a wrongful conviction. That's all I have. Thank you.
All right. Before taking the podium, I've been a listener here, and I just want to say what a fantastic experience this has been, just listening to the talks today. So once again, huge kudos and thanks to the Quattrones and to Dean Fitz and to John. It's just fantastic. So we're commissioned to talk about what we know and what we don't. And the question that some of us exchanged in preparing for this panel is, there's so much we don't, so how do we even divvy up the work and approach this topic? So, because there's just way too much we don't know. One, as Barry mentioned today, there's so little we know about the fundamental statistics of how the criminal justice works. And that's mind-boggling. It's these kind of trivial details that are they're so easy to collect, they're so impactful, and yet we know nothing, right? And then there's lots of scientific questions and lots of unanswered research issues, and Sam Gross is going to be speaking about that in a minute. What I'd like to speak about is a much more fundamental, close-to-home, low-level lack of knowledge, and that's how good or how truthful are the facts that we use in criminal trials day in and day out. I'll be speaking mostly about human testimony as opposed to forensic testimony. So here are two key observations that I'd like to put forth. One is, and I'm speaking only about non-trivial cases, because many of the cases, in fact, the majority of cases really don't raise these problems. But all the kind of cases that interest us, that put the system to the test, fall into the non-trivial cases. So we've got to think separately about the investigation phase and about the adjudicatory phase. And one of the observations is that oftentimes the investigation just produces some sort of unknown mix of accurate and inaccurate evidence. And that's what we go for. That's what we go with. And that's what the entire procedures are built of. And let's call this problem the limited accuracy of the evidence. The adjudicatory phase, on the other hand, has got a limited ability to distinguish between the accurate and inaccurate evidence produced upstream, and call that the problem of the diagnosticity of the adjudicatory phase. Now, what's really important, and then I hope that these conversations bring to light, especially with these more sort of systemic approaches that I think are tremendously important, is to understand the interrelationship between these two phases, how the investigative phase affects the adjudicatory phase, but also the feedback loop of how the investigation anticipates adjudication is affected by it in return. So looking at these kinds of, I'll be focusing mostly on the first arrow here today, but it's really important to keep both in mind. So what might be causing this limited accuracy of the evidence? Basically, the procedures that are used day in, day out in all 18,000 police departments across this country are oftentimes inadequate. They're rarely standardized. The training is somewhat limited. The oversight is problematic. We don't have, unfortunately, a minister of justice who can actually issue a directive like you do in England or in Canada, and everybody sort of falls in line, or at least should. So I'm not going to speak about one type of failure, and that is that what we call spontaneous errors just don't get caught. It's the kind of errors that people make, and we all make on a daily basis. That's to be human. What I do want to speak about is to my mind, a more important category, and that's errors that are induced by the investigation when we conduct the lineup incorrectly, or conduct an interview incorrectly, or overdo it in an interrogation, for example. We are actually inducing errors, which is, of course, a real problem. They're not random. Usually these are directional errors. They tend to confirm whatever the investigative hypothesis is. There's a lot of cross-contamination which causes errors to escalate, and which also causes a problem for the users on the other end who deem corroboration because they see lots of little bits of evidence lining up, all pointing towards guilt, sometimes towards innocence. What they cannot see is that at the back of the stage where the evidence was produced, there was a lot of sort of cross-influence, which takes away the sort of the independence of each source of evidence, which really means that the corroboration, the apparent corroboration, really isn't true corroboration. But the other kind of problem that gets created in the investigation is what I would call evidence drift. And that's sort of gradual shifting of evidence from the initial statements given to the police to the ultimate sort of decorous, synthetic, bombastic sometimes evidence given in court, which has got that very court-like nature to it, and it's just not always the same evidence, and lots of false convictions actually you see the trace, where we don't always have the early information, but in some cases when we do, we see it. The problem there, of course, is contamination, and again, it tends to converge towards a particular conclusion. Now, what are the problems at the other end, at the diagnosticity end, and I'll skip again the sort of the more spontaneous issues that are sort of inherent to the humanity of the fact finders, but what I really want to emphasize is the poor access that we have to investigative procedures. Call this the opacity of the investigation. And those two factors I mentioned before show up here again. We have no trace of the errors induced by the investigation, or at least I should say there's a scarcity of traces. So we don't really know what was caused by what errors were induced by the investigation. And the second is we don't have access, we don't always, or not often enough, have access to the original statements, which makes it hard to actually ascertain this evidence drift. Therefore, we don't know whether the testimony reported in court 6 months, 2 years after the event is really what the witness originally said, or it's already gone through the sort of churning machine and it's sort of shifted over time. So what I'd like to do is to really speak about just the first of these two and to give you just a very quick run through. And by the way, these two will sort of capture what I'd like to speak about, what we don't know. But I'd like to focus on the first and just run through very briefly a laundry list of experimental psychological findings that show you just how many things get lost because we don't have a good count, a good record of the investigative procedure. And at the end, of course, the suggestion is going to be very much like Jim's before, just tape the whole thing. So, the things we don't know because we don't collect really easily available evidence includes, and I'll speak about 3 types of investigation. One will be interview with eyewitnesses, just bystanders or who sometimes victims. Suggestive questions shown in experiments time and time again alter the responses that witnesses give. Then there's suggested facts, so it's not so much how we phrase the question, but facts that we sort of plant in the whole discussion, oftentimes unwittingly. But again, if you don't have a tape of who said what, you won't know where each statement came from. Memory conformity is a finding that when 2 witnesses speak to each other, and then afterwards they get tested separately for their memory, you see a bleeding of memory from one to the next. Guesswork, when people are asked to testify about events and they don't know responses, sometimes they guess. And we can know that because we ask them questions about which the facts weren't in the stimulus. Later on, they report their responses as if they were memories. The same thing applies with forced confabulation, when sometimes the witnesses say, I don't know the answer, and then the experimenter will say, it doesn't matter, just give us your best guess. And then you test them again sometime later. They cannot distinguish between their guesses, or the forced guesses in this case, and their actually authentic memories. Repetition is another cause for error. Someone says they don't know the answer, you ask them again and again and again, especially if it's separated over different sessions. At the end they will produce an answer, but it's not really anything they remember, it's what they feel compelled to produce. Exhortation, when you tell them to try harder, when you tell them that most people get it right, all these kinds of social influences cause people to give you wrong answers. By wrong, it means they're just making it up because they don't remember. Confidence inflation, you can inflate and, by the way, deflate confidence of witnesses quite easily by giving them feedback and such. And then an important part here is that basically when there is no recording, the investigators don't remember much of the responses. They lose data, sometimes important data, and they have close to 0 memory for the way they phrase the questions. Again, things that could affect all of the above. Let me switch now to the second domain of lineups. Lineup composition. If we don't have an authentic copy of what the lineup actually looked like, we won't know whether or not the composition biased the responses. And lots of studies have shown that depends who you put in the lineup as the innocent fillers will affect the likelihood that your suspect will get picked. Likewise with lineup instructions, what exactly was the witness told as they entered? Sometimes subtle changes in the verbiage of the instructions, including things like just mentioning the witness might not be there, can really change response rates. And by changing response rates, you're affecting accuracy rates. Lots of real-life cases show that, and this is almost too obvious to mention, you don't need experiments for this, that many of the falsely convicted people who were picked out of lineups, their identities were leaked, either wittingly or unwittingly by the police officers to the witnesses. Other experiments show that even when the administrator does not officially, explicitly, or in any sort of explicit manner convey this identity of the suspect, you actually do get lots of subtle leakage, including body language or language that doesn't look like that it's revealing the identity, but it does leak through and cause pics that are skewed towards the administrator's theory or knowledge of the suspect. Whether telling the witness that a co-witness picked somebody without even saying whom they picked affects behavior. And a very important one is giving feedback to the witness that you either picked the right guy or not, and this is something that happens quite routinely in real life investigations, has a strong influence on confidence, and that thereafter can have a strong influence on the likelihood that the case be referred to prosecution and prosecuted and so on and so forth. I'll just point out another thing that we miss by not recording is the actual authentic statement of confidence of the witness, which actually is a somewhat diagnostic measure of their accuracy. The third domain is in interrogations, and now I'm of course referring to Jim Trainon's talk. Threats have been shown in experiments and certainly in observational research to have a very strong impact, even when they're just implicit threats, as do promises. So promises, even when they're not explicit promises, they're often interpreted as implicit statements of leniency, depletion of the person's resources, just weakening them and beating them into submission, suggested facts that are very important in the sort of the second order analysis of a confession, is that how do we know to believe a confession or not? Oftentimes we all look, well, what's in the narrative? Are there facts that weren't known, and so on and so forth? And Miranda waivers I'm putting in parentheses because I do not see that as an issue of accuracy, but since we do waste a lot of adjudicatory resources on trying to figure out whether the waiver was given or not, that's the easiest thing that we would get by taping everything. Just referring back for a moment, this is an important analysis. It's a content analysis of the first 20 false convictions that were examined, that were DNA exonerations. And I put a separating line here, but basically 100% of the confessions included a number of details that there is no way that a person who gave a false confession could have actually known. Right? The time of day, location, the visual crime detail, the victim's behavior, and also high percentages also included things like the victim's words and utterances and physical appearance and so on. So these are facts that there is pretty much no other explanation for the witnesses, for these false confessors to have known, but the fact that it was leaked to them. And these are easily picked up if we tape, but we've got to tape everything, the entire interrogation, not just a confession. So just to kind of put things in perspective, so we're working in a system where we don't tape interrogations, we don't tape lineups, we don't tape interviews. Now, of course, some jurisdictions do, but as a general proposition, we tape very little. Just imagine a medical system that doesn't record the medical tests or the lab results or the radiological images or ECG printouts. So that's all available, but we just don't bother, and we just rely on, let's say, maybe a physician's personal impression. Yeah, this is the conclusion I came to. Just imagine the aviation, the world of aviation, working without black boxes and no recordings of cockpits or communications with ground control, and just again relying on, the personal impressions of pilots or controllers and such. It just doesn't make any sense given the fact, again, that technology is there and all we've got to do is hit the play button. So, not the play, the record button, I apologize. Suggestions for reform, basically, I think that what we need is a paradigm shift in our whole jurisprudential approach, and this goes back to sort of complaints about the fact that we have prioritized constitutional procedural rights rather than factual analyses. And basically, what that entails is to focus on the investigative phase. I think we pay way too much attention to courtroom stuff, or we pay much too attention to the constitutional rights that get violated in the investigative process, such as, illegal searches and such. But there's very, very little you'll find in criminal procedure casebooks that we teach in law schools that deals with the accuracy of the process. So, and focusing on the investigation is important. It's the birthplace of the evidence and, of course, of the errors. It's also amenable to reform, and that's the good news, because it's quite easy to actually change police procedures. At least we know where to go, and there are prospects for reform. So, there are two parts to that. One is best practices that I haven't spoken about, so I graded out. And the second has to do with what we don't know. And that is what we don't know but can know is a lot of all the stuff I just listed. All those potential errors we can know. But for some reason we don't. We don't bother collecting. We don't insist on it. And we send people to prison and sometimes kill them based on facts that we just don't know how reliable they are. And despite the fact that it would be so easy to collect and use for our analysis. So basically what we should do, like I mentioned, just hit the record button, create the record of all encounters with all witnesses and just make it open and share. It's just, just like the DC forensic department. Nobody wants these wrongful convictions. Just give it to everybody. There are lots of reasons why some law enforcement object. I won't go into all of them, but they are quite unpersuasive, I think. But goals of transparency, we'd see two types. We'd see diagnostic goals, such as enable detection of induced error. And it's important that it's for all stakeholders. So it's not just the fact finders at trial, but it's for everybody along the line, because there's so many informal fact-finding phases during the process. The defense attorney has to decide the strategy and whether they can take the case on. And the prosecutor has to decide what kind of charges to file and how hard to fight and what kind of plea bargain to offer. And of course the judge in admissibility and on and on. So, and the second, again, diagnostic, is to expose the evidence drift, right? So we'll be able to see what we had at the beginning, where we come at the end, and to make some assessments of how much we rely on that evidence that was given so ceremoniously in court. So, but I'd like to say that the prophylactic benefits are probably even more valuable. So I don't have that much time, so I'll run through this quickly, but infusing the entire process with the best available evidence seems to me like a desirable goal. Prevent evidence drift and preserve, and that can be done by preserving human evidence. We'd like to memorialize those raw statements, and that would prevent against memory loss, prevent against post-event contamination, would also minimize the pressure on witnesses, I believe, because then witnesses could say, look, I've already given the full statements on tape, and that's how I remembered it then, and leave me alone. Another type of prophylactic benefit has to do with the legal system. So we kind of soften the excesses of the adversarial relationships because the evidence is more reliable to start off with, and it's shared and nobody's suspecting anybody. And you're also giving litigants much less to fight about. So you reduce the distrust, which has been shown in experiments to cause more bias. People are more biased when they think that someone else is distrusting them and they distrust them and so on. And it actually escalates. We eliminate lots of the discovery battles and, of course, the violations of discovery. We overall reduce litigation because we've got a more transparent and more accurate system to start off with. We free up resources, we reduce costs, and basically just try to reduce unjust prosecutions, but also frivolous defense claims that are extremely wasteful and don't do the system much good. For police departments, there are advantages too. It's a tool for training, for oversight, for quality assurance. It's a way to increase adherence to best practices that I mentioned before very quickly. You collect better evidence because it's there. You don't have to rely on your memory, on your notes. You deter misconduct because people are behaving on tape, or they could be taped. You collect more evidence. There's a nice RAND study that shows that lots of good evidence gets lost because we don't actually track it. We reduce pressure on police officers because you reduce criticism of their work. You enhance the persuasiveness of their testimony, and you minimize the need of that testimony, so they waste less time in court. And basically it just enhanced the overall sense of professionalism of police officers, but really at the same time enhanced the integrity of the entire process that comes thereafter. Thank you very much.
That's it.
Thank you.
Well, it is a pleasure to be here, and I won't repeat all the flattering things people have been saying, but when I was told I'd be doing this at 4:45 or whatever it is, after a full day, as the last barrier between you and a reception, I thought nobody would be here. However, I have the assignment of talking about really primarily what we don't know. I will introduce as much as I can something about what we do know. I hope this is not too much of a wet blanket. There's another way to look at it. One way to describe the challenge of an intellectual endeavor is to measure our ignorance, what it is we still need to find out. And from that point of view, learning about false convictions is really challenging. And the Quattrone Center has taken on a wonderful topic that will get us a lot of wonderful new knowledge. For example, let's start with this one. What's the rate of false convictions? Well, we've been told. Justice Scalia, I'm tempted to go back to the 30s and pick up a more eminent justice who never was on the Supreme Court, but Justice Scalia, in a concurring opinion by himself, told us that we have an error rate of 0.027%. In other words, this is not a problem anybody should care about. There's nothing to be worried about here. And everybody's reaction when they heard that was, that's really stupid. And it is. But it's worth stopping to think why something as dumb as that gets published. And I don't mean in the U.S. reports. This is a justice of the Supreme Court. It was a concurrence by himself. He can publish anything he wants. But he was actually quoting a prosecutor who published the same thing in the New York Times, where they have some standards. And what it reflected is this. You start with the known exonerations as of when this was published, 2004. 340, that's actually from a study that I did and published in 2004. He says, that's 340, let's be generous, we'll call it 400. Let's be really generous, we'll call it 4,000. But that's in a country in which we have something like 1 million felony convictions a year. So you do the math and you get to I have a typo there, 0.27% or 0.0027. So a reaction to that is, okay, that's stupid because there are lots and lots of false convictions that we don't know about. And that's true. There are lots of them. The convictions we know about, the false convictions we know about, are those that end up being discovered and turn into exonerations. And those, back then in particular, were primarily, overwhelmingly, in rape and murder cases. But even there, we don't know about most false convictions in those cases. We know almost nothing about false convictions in other crimes of violence, a little in some robbery cases, but not many others. We have a handful of false convictions that we know about in guilty plea cases, where the defendant pled guilty in a system in which 95% of those million felony convictions a year are people who pled guilty and accepted plea bargains. We have essentially no exonerations in nonviolent crimes. Now I'm exaggerating, but we're talking about a tiny number, dozens. Virtually none in cases in which people didn't receive long prison sentences. Now again, we're learning more and we have more of those, but still very few. And we know essentially nothing about false convictions in juvenile cases. We know something, a very little bit, about false convictions of juveniles who were tried in adult courts. But the great majority of juveniles who are tried and convicted for serious crimes are tried in juvenile institutions, and that is an opaque system from our point of view. We don't even know about most exonerations. That's the next lesson, and that was actually something that was news to me when I first started working on this 10, maybe 12 years ago. Our image of an exoneration, is I think of it as a Barry Scheck moment. There's a press conference on the courtroom steps. There are TV cameras. And this happens. It's happened to some of the people who are in this room, and it's very important and influential. But most exonerations receive very little attention. Many of them receive no attention whatever in the press, and as far as we can tell, most of them are still unknown. So we now know about a lot more. If you look at this nice slide here, this is a promo for my outfit, the National Registry of Exonerations. And you'll see that we now have up here, if I can get this to work, we now know of 1,342 exonerations from 1989 through today. That includes something like 620 from 1989 through 2003, the same period for which in 2004 we knew of 340. So for that period, that 15-year period, we have since learned about another 280 exonerations that were unknown to anybody that we could, or from any source we could find when we first studied it. And we're learning about more of these exonerations constantly. But the fact that we're learning about them pretty much at the rate at which we can do the work to locate them, and that we keep finding new ways to search for them, tells us that there are many more out there, exonerations that received very little attention, that occurred years ago, and that aren't part of any information that we're using. It's beginning to broaden our understanding. It is a cause for great optimism. Denise, who is personally responsible for several dozen of these that we found out about, wanted to make sure that I didn't sound too glum about this, and I'm not. There's a reason why I'm spending my life doing this. But we should still have to be realistic about how limited this information is, and even at the tail end, the cases that are discovered, which is clearly a very small minority of false convictions, most of those remain hidden beneath the waves. Okay. So we can go back and tell Justice Scalia, that's stupid. There are lots and lots of false convictions that we don't know about. But there's another side to that. Exonerations. Those are exonerations that we don't know about. And what we don't know about them is really everything. We can guess about it. We don't know how many there are. We don't know where they occurred. We don't know what crimes there were. We don't know what caused them. We may begin to learn more. But even among the exonerations that did occur, we probably don't know about most of those and what the crimes were or how they happened or how they unraveled later on. What about causes? Okay, what causes false convictions? Well, there's a truth about this that everybody knows, right? Eyewitness misidentification, right? The Innocence Project website tells us it's the leading cause of false convictions. Report by the Justice Department. I've just chosen a couple of, endless array of reports that say this. For example, I myself, some 30 years ago, said eyewitness misidentification is by far the most common cause of erroneous convictions. Well, we now have some more data on this. Now that we have, this is from January 1st when we had 1,281 cases, and what you see there is that eyewitness misidentification is a big problem, but across all the cases we know about, it's involved in 38%. Perjury or false accusation, 56%, and official misconduct in 46%. Now, if you look up here at sexual assaults, you see that eyewitness misidentification is the dominant cause of known false convictions in sexual assault cases, which are the most common, in fact, the dominant group among the DNA exonerations that the Innocence Project lists. So there's a reason for this misconception. During the period in which we were learning so much about false convictions initially as a result of the introduction of DNA identification technology, we learned primarily about rape cases, and there eyewitness misidentification is the big problem. Back in the 80s, when I was doing research on it, pre-DNA, when we knew about very few false convictions, the most common cases we knew about were robberies, where eyewitness misidentification is also the dominant issue. But now that we learn about many more cases, especially the largest group, which is homicides, we see that it's not the most common issue among the cases we know about. And I could actually spend any amount of time talking about this table, because what it really shows is that if you want to think about the causes of false convictions to the extent that we know them, it's best not to think about this as a single issue, or perhaps best not to think of it as a single pathology or disease, but as a collection of different pathologies that have different causes. And there are others that we don't know. If I had to bet what the most common cause of false convictions is, among the cases that we don't know about, which is almost certainly the great majority, I would bet that it's pretrial detention, that it's people who can't make bail, who are innocent, accepting plea bargains that will allow them to go home now or allow them to go home in 2 weeks rather than waiting another 3 months to go to trial. That could account for tens of thousands of cases a year, and we never see any of them in this list. What else? We don't know the process by which the causes that we know about do produce false convictions. So people don't focus on this a lot, but there are a couple of studies, mine and one by Drizzen and Leo, not Leo and Drizzen, that collected information on misidentifications and false confessions across the board, and then point out in passing, not a central observation, that in both cases, a majority of those that got enough attention to be located and all resulted in arrests, the majority of them did not produce convictions. And it's likely that the false confessions and eyewitness misidentifications that did not produce convictions are harder to identify, harder to find, and more likely to be underreported than those that did produce convictions. So it's probable that the great majority of both of these types of errors don't produce convictions, which is good news. But it means that we haven't figured out how they do produce convictions, and as Jim Doyle and many people have pointed out, but Jim Doyle has been trying to get us all to understand, it's usually not a single error, not a single eyewitness misidentification, possibly not even a single false confession. What do we know? I'm almost running out of time, so I'll spend a very little bit of time on this because I do want to sound like I'm not as glum as this picture makes it appear to be. The first and the most important thing we know is what we learned from the DNA exonerations and from many other exonerations since, and that is that false convictions occur on a regular basis, that this is a much bigger problem than Judge Learned Hand in the 1930s, or Judge Scalia or other people would like to believe, that it's something that happens commonly, and something about some of the common causes of it. And that is hugely important. Right? I mean, that's more important really than anything else we've learned. And the more we learn about different categories of exonerations, the more that will teach us how to avoid them. Second, there's some, if you look at the data that we have, there's some very strong patterns that stand out. I'm going to mention a couple of them, which I think are reliable enough to say this is teaching us, even given the huge limitations of the data, something that will last. For example, among rape exonerations, cases with black defendants and white victims are hugely overrepresented compared to their proportion of the population, a ratio of 8 to 1 or more. It is hard to believe that that isn't a result of a systematic problem. Well-known fact that nobody happened to mention, I don't think, but is extremely important. False confessions among those among the exonerees that we have, those who were juveniles or had some type of mental disability are vastly more likely to have falsely confessed than others. What else do we know? We know much, much more about death sentences than about any other category of crime in the United States. The evidentiary problems that Dan was mentioning, just not knowing routine things, is much less of a problem for death sentences. And there we actually have initial estimates on the rate of false convictions, and they're surprisingly high, 2.3 to 3.3%. There's a new study, a better one with a higher estimate that will come out in a month or so. You should watch for that. We also know enough about them to be able to compare them to other cases, and we see a couple of patterns. I'll mention two here. Exonerations are much more common among defendants who were sentenced to death who had no criminal records than those defendants who were sentenced to death who were not exonerated. And compared to death sentences where there were no exonerations, those that resulted in exonerations were the product of much longer investigations, which makes a lot of sense. These are harder cases, perhaps more likely to produce errors. I'll stop there because have another second? Should I go on for it?
Yeah, 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay. Outcome measures. This was discussed before. I'm not going to belabor the issue. Outcome measures in this context is almost impossible. But here's one outcome that we can detect. The effect of DNA testing. Okay. This is not a great measure of it, but it's a measure that's available. Among the exonerations, if you look at those who were convicted before 2000, 22% of those were rape cases. If you look at those who were convicted after 2000, the percentage of rapes among exonerations is down to 9%. Before 2000, those are overwhelmingly DNA exonerations. After that, they are primarily not DNA exonerations. Now, there are methodological problems in reaching any conclusion from this data. I could go on about that at very boring length. But the pattern is so strong that I think you would say, yes, this is strong evidence that the availability of DNA pre-trial is reducing the rate of false convictions in rape cases. Being able to do this in other contexts, it may be very hard, but we can get started, and if we keep going, we'll learn things. Okay.
I'm not going to test people's patience any longer. We're 5 o'clock. We're about 15 minutes over. Everybody here will be around for questions. We'll be around tomorrow rather than take questions here. John promises drinks, right? So we'll go out, enjoy that. Glad you were here all day. We have more to discuss tomorrow, maybe some more answers. We didn't get all the answers today. We'll try to do it tomorrow. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.